So if things develop the way we say they are, our cities are going to be very highly populated over the next decade or two, and we need to be thinking about a couple of issues. One in particular, how do we maintain the quality of life in cities that were the very reason why people wanted to move there in the first place? And is there a way to tap the talents and energies of this new population of urban dwellers? That's what the next panel is going to be addressing, so let's introduce them. The Director of Urban Design for the engineering firm AECOM from New York City, please welcome Joni Fu. From Toronto, the Chief Planner for the city that is now the fastest growing in North America, please welcome Jennifer Kiesmet. From New York City also, Senior Vice President of Programs for the New York Restoration Project, welcome Deborah Martin. And our moderator for the panel is none other than Carol Coletta, Vice President at the Knight Foundation, a good friend and former colleague at the American Architectural Foundation. Welcome and enlighten us.
That's okay. Thanks, Ron. Okay, so you're the people who are staying for the drinks, right? Okay, and Fred told us that we're all happier in the morning than in the afternoon. So we have a group of people eager for drinks and unhappy. Yeah, right. Okay. So we're going to try to make this interesting though, and move fast. And so I want to jump right into questions. And I also want to invite you, if you have a question. Don't wait until the end. Just if you'll go to a mic, I'll wave your hand. I'll make sure we get to you. And we want to make this as conversational as possible. Joni, let me start with you because AECOM works all over the world. You see cities all over the world. Have you seen cities that have responded to the challenges of fast growth with increased livability? Which would be a neat trick if you could do it.
I think cities are constantly challenged with livability. I think of cities and talking about livability or quality of life in different layers. By different layers, I mean transportation, open space, landscaping, job opportunity, land use, all the things that, all the elements that make up what we do about cities, planning cities and urban design. I think some of the challenges are...
We got a mic, hang on, Joni, we've got a mic problem. I was worried about that.
But can you hear me okay though?
No, I think they can't.
Is it better now?
No.
Is it better now? Okay, now you can hear me. I can't sit back. Is this better?
I think they still can. Do you have a handheld? Yeah. Why don't you just grab it? Joni, we're going to...
Well, maybe someone else could jump in.
All of a sudden, I thought...
Is it working better now? Can you hear me?
Yeah, actually.
Okay, so I was saying livability, quality of life is measured by the different elements or different layers of city that we professional designers like to talk about, such as transportation, open space, land use, zoning, different connectivity, and so. For example, I want to say New York City, because I live and work here. I think the new bike program or the bike connections, not so much the bike program, but the connectivity of bike trails. It's an up on livability in New York City. The land use of different technology clusters, the development of technology and research development. Clusters in Queens and Brooklyn and other places is a livability issue where you can actually bring workers closer to residents and residents closer to it's a challenge that different cities constantly face about how to actually merge workers and residents, bring them closer together. So those two are examples that I can think of right now.
Good. Jennifer, over the weekend, I was reading a review copy of Vishon Chakrabarty's new book, Country of Cities. It's very good, and it's interesting that Vishon's book and Bruce's books are coming out in sort of the same time period. I think they will be interesting reads back to back. But one of the things he bases his thinking on is this notion of hyperdensity, which he defines as the density we need to support subways, which is substantial. But in Toronto, where you work, you've had these ongoing debates about transit. Obviously, if we're going to grow as cities, we have to have transit, and yet there's a real tension in Toronto in getting the transit you need. Talk about what's happened there.
Well, the important thing to know is that you need hyperdensity to support subways, but you don't need hyperdensities to support light rail transit, for example, or other kinds of systems. So just as a qualifier in terms of that comment.
Right.
But if we step back and we look at the city of Toronto, back in 1945, we were the smallest city in the world to be building a subway system. And we still have a subway system that integrates in a pretty radical way. Portland, Oregon has tried to emulate this, where we integrate light rail with buses, with the subway system in such a way that we have a very comprehensive network of subway of transit coverage across the whole city. And the city's huge, by the way. Just to give you a sense of scale, the city of Toronto is 613 square kilometers. I don't know what that is in miles. But it's about 5 times the size of Manhattan, and in part because we're an amalgamated city, which means we have this really vast area. And the notion of significantly intensifying such a vast area to have subways everywhere is simply not realistic. You're simply not going to get the kinds of densities that can accommodate a subway everywhere. And that's part of what the debate is about, because this has been pitted as an urban versus a suburban conversation where there's very low densities in some parts of the city and very high density in the core of the city. And there's a sense that we want our subways too. We want our subways out in the periphery of the city. Why are we second-class citizens getting stuck with light rail transit? And so that's a bit of the debate, is part of an urban form problem that we have in the city, because we're very, very urban and we're very suburban. And so you have different political philosophies that underpin how you ought to plan and grow in those different environments. And that's part of the challenge.
You know, this reminds me of actually 2 previous speakers, right? Mayor Daley talked about the Metropolitan Mayor's Council that he put together of all the mayors in Chicagoland. And one of the things he famously says about that, we just agreed that we would only talk about the things we could agree on. And the things we couldn't agree on, we would just leave them off the table. And then, of course, we heard Bruce talk about, as he has now for a number of years, the notion of regionalism, metro, America, so forth. It feels to me like amalgamation or consolidation of governments is always accepted as a good thing that will strengthen cities, and yet I'm not sure that's
the logic.
That's the logic.
Well,
but
the argument is that there's economies of scale. That that you in fact can get bigger, and as a result, you have 1 fire chief instead of 7 fire chiefs. So we were 7 cities that amalgamated. But we, of course, know that there is a tipping point where you lose those economies of scale and where things, in fact, become much more complicated. So, for example, it just took us 10 years to amalgamate or to really harmonize our existing zoning bylaw. It was 10 years of a full-time team because there were 43 different zoning bylaws that all had different languages, that all had a different definition of a side yard setback. And all of that had to be negotiated in a public process. And it had to be negotiated politically, and then it had to be brought forward to city council. So you do reach a point, I think, where you lose those economies of scale. So that's not a good argument. But Richard Daley's argument is probably a pretty good one, which is that, well, we really ought to be thinking at the regional level.
Right.
Because so many of the issues that we face actually move much beyond our municipal boundaries, and particularly when we start looking from a resilient city perspective, and we want to look at weather patterns and water supply and movement patterns, well, that's not constrained to just the most urban part of a city. So, is it a model that's a perfect model? No, it's not. And are there tensions that emerge as a result of that? Yes, absolutely. Is it something that should be undone? Well, I would never advocate that, because that's like unscrambling eggs. It would just be this, or pushing water uphill. It would just be this absolute nightmare to try and extract what has been brought together. But it does come back to the challenge of the transit funding and where the transit goes. And it's one of the reasons why, in thinking about where density belongs in the city, advocating for creating those mid-rise corridors, which is a much more palatable urban form in the more suburban part of the city, is an important strategy moving forward.
Yeah. Deborah, as you work in New York, you know that in some ways we obviously need density for many good reasons, and yet not in my backyard, right? So it seems like there's always this tension between increased density and what people perceive as as giving up in the face of new development or increased density. Is there a way to diffuse that tension?
In the face of like increasing density in neighborhood, let's say with a new development, when you're doing an infill project or whatever in a space, I mean, yeah, I think there's ways to diffuse the tension. I mean, in New York development, we're like a very it's interesting for me to hear you talk about Toronto, because that question of the tension between the suburban and the urban we do have parts of the city that are more suburban in the way that they lay out, but that's not really the question here. The question here, to my mind, is more of a kind of brawl between, it's an economic question, because New York is a capitalist city. Change has always been our way. Preservation only took root like relatively recently. We've destroyed many wonderful old things in the face of the new, maybe most notably the old Penn Station. So, the question is, are there other values that come into play, and how do we express those values? And I think that's a question of understanding who lives in certain places and what zoning or other mechanisms do we want to bring to bear to maintain livability in the face of maximum density, because the forces of money and maximum density will always win without other checks and balances.
Joni?
Well, let me just add that.
Why don't you speak into the mic?
Okay. I think one way of diffusing the density issue is not to talk about density in isolation, because it's very hard for people to focus on the livability and quality of life for proposed development only looking at density. If density is the only subject on the table, that kind of not in my backyard or not in my neighborhood, why not over there, it becomes very apparent. And when density is talked alongside things as retail, mix of uses, or other amenities such as open space or transportation issues, I think it's easier to talk about a neighborhood building or city building holistically rather than just density alone. I mean,
Right.
for instance, we go through community workshops and outreach programs all day long, right? Every project has one. And, it's always talking about understanding the basis of what we're doing comes first, and then topical discussions underlying density would be transportation, the open space, school system, all those other issues that makes up the neighborhood as a whole.
Yeah.
But I think livability is, to me, a question of scale, because you have the macro scale systems that contribute to livability, like transportation, but then where most people live, what's like the ancient kind of scale of living, is the neighborhood scale. So what are the livability questions at the neighborhood scale differ from what the livability questions are at the city scale. So you're moving back and forth in between scale. So then at the neighborhood scale, I think that's when questions of open space and the quality of the street come into play. And in this city, and I think in much of the United States, We have permeated private space over public space that's our history. I own it and I'm doing what I want on it.
Yeah.
And we're coming to mature, certainly as a city and as a nation, we're starting to understand that in the same way that your apartment serves multiple functions for you personally, in that you do many things within your home, our public spaces have to serve multiple functions for our cities. So at the neighborhood scale, they have to provide a place to recreate, maybe to plant some tomatoes, and they have to be flexible in multiple uses. So maybe they're green infrastructure, maybe they can collect stormwater. I'm working on a project right now where we're putting in, it's a community garden that my organization owns, New York Restoration Project, and we're building a casita, which is a traditional Latin American, like a recreational structure that exists in gardens. And we're putting solar panels on the roof, and it's going to become a hub for charging up your cell phones. And it's a very poor neighborhood in the South Bronx where, people are not getting in their SUVs and heading upstate when there's a blackout. So, our garden will do that too. It'll be a hub for charging up. So they have to have, I think our open spaces are critical and key to livability, but they have to be managed in a way that provides multiple kinds of value.
Mm-hmm. I'm so surprised to hear you say that that you're kind of grappling with this notion of moving from the private space to the public space, because it seems like you do that so well in New York, that you live in smaller spaces and you have these wonderful public spaces, this wonderful cafe.
I'm so glad that you're saying that.
Well, it sounds like you've kind of got that nailed, and that's the big struggle that we're really having in Toronto right now, because we have been growing exponentially. We've built 70,000 units in 5 years. We have another 147 units in the pipeline right now. Tremendous amount of growth. Most of it is right in the core, and people are choosing to live in the core because they want to walk to work and they want to take transit. They want to be a part of the arts and culture scene. But the challenge is that on the public side, we're not investing in the public spaces that actually provide the amenity that make that kind of an environment so livable. And I think it's our great risk as a city. You can't just cram a lot of density into one space and say, oh yay, everyone can walk to work, everyone's happy. It doesn't quite work that way. People need places to go with their dogs. People need places to go with their children. People need the kind of public spaces where they can interact informally. And the risk is, and I think this is a big part of the answer to the livability question, is that the counterpoint to significantly increasing density is significantly increasing public space.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
That the more dense it becomes, the more important that public space becomes, and the design of that public space, the community garden work you do, becomes really central to the livability succeeding.
And I want to add, I think 20 years ago when I first started this career or profession, the sort of rule of thumb, if you have a large piece of land and it's going through the redevelopment process, at least 30 or 35% of the land should be used for open space. Waterfront, streets included, plazas, space, different type of variety of open spaces. We're not talking about just one big central park, So open spaces are embedded within different communities, and then obviously different neighborhoods would also have different density, so that you're not all crammed in as high-rise or high-rise apartment or all townhouses. You want a variety, and that's what makes city livable and attractive, and people want to go there because of the variety and choices you're offered. And nowadays, I think we're looking at 50% or more.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So if a client comes to me and we're doing a project in Brazil, for instance, or in Rio, the very first rule for economics is to say only 50% of your ownership would be revenue generating. And then we can talk about what kind of density we're talking about, high rise or low rise, or a variety of development proposals. But basic rule, 50% is for open space, and that's what makes density work, because you propose that to different city officials, and they would consider that as a baseline.
But that's only if you have open space. That's if you're starting with a blank slate, and then you could say, okay,
That's
50
right.
we leave aside,
True.
and 50. That's not the case in older cities like New York. That's not the case at all. There's hardly any soft sites anywhere in the city. So
Right,
I
but
think,
we have the infrastructure already established with great open spaces, so you kind of like work from
sort of.
from
We're not
both
close
ends.
to 50%,
Well,
or 35, really.
well, if you count all the streets, we have a lot of streets.
Oh, yeah, if you add
Right.
the streets in, but open space that's occupiable. I mean, what DOT has done, I'm sure Jeanette talked about that this morning, reclaiming parts of streets.
Right.
To me, that's where the future is in older cities. I don't know if that's the case in Toronto, but things like reclaiming parts of streets, like the High Line, maybe even things on roofs, because we have parts of the city, yes, there are, I mean, I'm an optimist and I love the city, and yes, there are amazing public spaces, but you know, our organization focuses on open spaces in low-income communities, and that's not the case. There are many, many communities where you have to go very far to get to any decent, safe, clean, like the basics. So, you know.
But this idea of the street system actually being part of the open space
Yeah.
system in the public realm
Absolutely.
is a, you know, it's a big and important shift in thinking, because even the difference of, you know, walking down a treed street versus a street that isn't treed.
Right.
One, you're just walking down the street. The other, you feel like you're walking through a park. So I think this notion that when we think about in more urban places, and we have a similar situation in the core of the city, it's different in other places, but thinking about the streets as the greatest opportunity to enhance livability as density is
Exactly.
added
Yeah.
is something that I think Jeanette kind of embodied so beautifully in
Exactly.
the work that she showed us today. And that's, you know, all over North America, we have these great big wide streets that are this breathtaking opportunity to reclaim as public space where people interact as we densify.
You know, it's, I know our subject is density and livability, but I can't help but think as you talk about open space and the precious nature of it in a city like New York or Toronto. I was in Detroit yesterday, and of course you're overwhelmed by the open space or the land that is not used productively, and it will be a long time before it's used productively. It's a city that was built for almost 3 million people. It has 750,000 now, and so you've got a few people scattered on a lot of landscape. What do you do with the open space? I'm kind of curious what your response, I mean, how would you tackle that? Again, it's a little bit of a flip from our...
I mean, like the shrinking city question, or like what do you do with a city that has too much land?
A city that has too much land that you can't imagine a market use for that land.
Density is the answer to that too, right?
Go.
Because part of the problem
But you need
is
economic growth, right? Like
Well,
if don't have-
you need
if don't have
economic
growth.
Well, you need economic growth, but I'm saying in the meantime, in the near term, you know, what is it that you can do with that land that then mitigates the sense of emptiness that is and desolation that really
Well, I mean, what they're doing there is they're trying. Tony Griffin at the Bond Center, if people are interested in Detroit, is doing it. You probably know about her project.
Sure.
But you know, the problem is if you have one person in a neighborhood and you're sending water, electric, police,
Sure.
obviously that's undesirable and it's inefficient. So if you can densify, move people into particular neighborhoods, it's better for social resilience, it's
Sure.
better for environmental resilience, and then proposals have run the gamut from put it into ag, urban ag, to reforest. They've done reforestation in Germany. Big parts of cities in the former East Germany have been turned back to forests. So, I mean, there's a range of things. But you're right, I think the economic question is what, even if you densify, like what are you doing there to make money?
Well, that's the catch-22, and this is in part where this conversation immediately links into the conversation about the creative economy and how we reinvent economies in cities like Detroit, because that's actually the key. You've got all that infrastructure, yet there's other places in North America where we're building new infrastructure. It doesn't make any sense. It's like we can waste infrastructure here and build new infrastructure in other places. The really big question
if
for
only
us.
people would behave rationally.
If only it would make it so much easier. But it really is it's really an economic development and a placemaking question.
It's a
because-
placemaking question, very
Well,
much so. I mean, it's both.
But it's about jobs, because you can have a beautiful
Sure,
place,
sure.
but if you can't support yourself and you can't figure out how you're going to take care of your family, then who cares if the streets are paved in gold? Who cares if you've got the most wonderful places to linger with your neighbors if you simply can't sustain yourself? So I think it actually is more of an economic development question, and it's about how economies reinvent themselves in these cities where there has been a fundamental transition. And it's a shame in some ways that we didn't notice earlier this risk of having these great places with great infrastructure and say, hey, let's not keep expanding endlessly when we've got this infrastructure that's underutilized. And I can speak from the Canadian perspective. We have sprawling municipalities across our entire country where we are providing water, roads, snow plowing at an absolute premium because the density is so low. And because the infrastructure is so underutilized, and the challenge is we're still building out new infrastructure in those same communities. And I think at a certain point, we kind of need to get called on that. And we have to start saying, well, wait a minute, we're not building new roads and new infrastructure until we start densifying and infilling the existing suburbs that we have.
Right, I just want to add, one thought on that is how do we actually link placemaking and density as a subject? Because places like Detroit and Newark, for instance, or other places where you have a lot of empty land and they're spread out all over the place. I think the placemaking idea that could help with densification is to start small. You want to start at a center. You want to start with a cluster rather than start at multiple places. That's one thought. I have an example. I'm working in a project in eastern Massachusetts, not a big city, a small city, where the city actually has a growth incentive zone, which is literally too large. Okay, and in the center downtown is actually a redevelopment project, which takes out acres and acres of parking lots, great parking lots. So it's a good thing, but the city is kind of like what you're saying, is trying to protect the growth investment zone, which has a number that they want to reach. But if they put all of those numbers in this redevelopment project, then what happens to the not the outskirts of the city, but what happened to the other property owners? So I think it is sort of a three-pronged subject that we have to group together, which is placemaking, density, and economic development. When those three things are all aligned and start small, would be my strategy to look at something like that.
I think those things can be joined because we now understand, like as a culture, and I think globally we understand that urban living can be very healthy socially, right? Like you encounter your neighbors, there's an exchange of ideas, there's free flow of capital. So in many ways, urban living is psychologically preferable to sprawl type living. So there are certain savings in there by increased mental and physical health from urban lifestyle. So I propose, and I'm looking at this for one of our projects right now, that if you can kind of look ahead and quantify the savings that you would have from improved physical and mental health, then you can access some of that and use it for funding of placemaking right now. Like, I just don't think any of this works unless you kind of join those things together. And so, like the idea of social impact bonds.
Well, there was very interesting conversation this morning from the woman at Goldman Sachs talking about capturing the savings and recidivism.
The Randall's Island project.
It's actually,
exactly that same idea.
Yeah, same idea, right? Yeah. So anticipating, which ought to work for sustainability, but for some reason, I don't think we figured it out yet.
It's because it's too broad. It's because we haven't quantified exactly. Like they can say, okay, 5 less kids go back into prison, so we've saved X number of dollars. How do you say, like, if we have 10 more trees on the street, and you can walk to work, and you could pick up your kid from school because the connection between this neighborhood and that neighborhood is better, where is the savings? Like, who gets those savings?
But we can quantify those things. We can quantify them
exactly,
as well.
We can.
And
we just haven't yet.
Well, we haven't. You're right. Although this city is really, really excited about measuring things.
Yes.
And I know it comes from your mayor. And
We're really excited.
It's really excited about measuring things. And it's fun to see all these measures because they tell us something really important.
Yes,
and
sometimes they do. Sometimes it can be a
a
distraction.
distraction. Fair
Because there's
enough.
quantitative measurement and there's qualitative.
Fair
See, it
enough.
always looks better from the outside.
It's true. It's true. I'm enamored at the moment. There's a wonderful book that's been written by a woman named Pamela Blay, and it's called Perverse Subsidies. And she basically looks at the subsidies that we give to infrastructure developments in an urban environment and in higher density environments versus other environments. And what's so interesting about what she quantifies is she begins to measure the impact to a municipality of its urban form and the way that urban form has different immediate but life cycle implications. And we've never done this. We would not have built our cities the way we've built them with a
Or
tremendous
more
amount of
importantly, we
sprawl.
wouldn't have built our suburbs.
We wouldn't have built our suburbs
Right.
the way they've been built if we had done the math, because we would have went, ooh, there's a lot of subsidy and we're not really that rich. You know, we can't
Well, we were
afford
at
that.
one time. We thought we were.
Yeah, we
We're
thought we
we're not
were.
anymore.
We thought we were.
exactly
Yeah,
it.
I think that's exactly it. But I think that we can quantify those things, and we can, you know, we're doing this great exercise in the GTA, the Greater Toronto Hamilton region. We have the wonderful accolade of being one of the worst congested areas in North America. People commute an average of 45 minutes each way in the GTA, so people spend a lot of time commuting.
Wow.
And we've had some wonderful work done by our Board of Trade where they've been quantifying the impact that has on labor, the impact that has on productivity. And essentially they're making the argument that unless we invest in transit in a significant way, that we're going to become an undesirable place to invest because our labor productivity is a key driver to the region's economy. So I think you can quantify the impact of the
Can we
walk.
interrupt to ask some
Absolutely.
questions?
Yes, absolutely, jump in, sorry.
Hi, my name's Shira Ganza. I work in the regional and community outreach function at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Previously was in city government. I was wondering if the panel could shift the discussion a little about how we look at density from open space, which I think, you know, living in New York City, we kind of get, but maybe other models you've seen around how density can help cities. Things that come to mind are maybe work share spaces on one end, or even to things around resilience. I know working for myself, volunteering in Sandy, certain elected officials could leverage density in places like Stuytown to really check, but when I went out to the Rockaways, there was nothing. There's no infrastructure. So I don't know, some different paradigms around how you can leverage density beyond just the infrastructure of open space and lots of people and buildings.
Thoughts?
Well, I'll maybe jump in just very quickly. I think one of the key drivers behind density with respect to resilience we heard earlier is reducing our carbon footprint, which we know, of course, is the reason for Sandy. So I think that the key driver as a rationale or as a philosophy for density is that in making much more compact places, we know we're reducing our impact on the environment. I'm not sure there's another paradigm that you can use. Maybe you have some ideas.
Well, no, I mean, I was just thinking of your example of Stuytown, and the Rockaways is not really like so much a density story as it is a kind of Manhattan, outer Queens story, and there's a great deal of money invested in making sure Manhattan stays the way it stays, and not as much in the Rockaways, unfortunately. So, you know, I think
But
that's
it's the same thing in NYCHA in Brooklyn. I mean, I was there too, and you could do it. So
you could do
you could do what you did in Stuytown and NYCHA in Brooklyn, which I did as well,
which was
which was really deploy people and utilize the density to get people to help. Whereas
well, I can tell you, I was out in the Rockaways right after Sandy, like the week after, and there was armies of people out there at that time. So there was a very robust response right then. The question is there the will at a municipal level to make the long-term investments? And that I don't know the answer to.
There's another question.
Actually, he's first.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. I wanted to ask actually about the issue of transportation equity, let's say. Edward Luce, who's the Washington editor of the Financial Times, had a great cover story 2 weekends ago that was the future of the American city. The last part about it just addressed really the effects, let's just say, of gentrification and average commute times of of different segments of the population. I wanted to throw out an interesting study that London School of Economics Urban Age Project did. So apparently Mexico City's average commute is 4 hours total. And Hong
Average?
Kong, 4 hours.
But average?
Daily average total, yes, and 14 minutes in Hong Kong. And secondly, interestingly, in London, and this will tie it back to my question, there were some articles in London during the London Olympic marathon run, when the tubes were closed, there was a whole, let's say, invisible class of people that took the subway for the first time and who avoided it because the fee is too high, and they normally take multiple buses and hours and hours and hours. So what I wanted to address then actually is a lot of the interventions that placemaking is doing, of course. It can't necessarily solve the problem of property values, but Saskia Sassen, for one, actually has written about a lot of the efforts in New York, and actually how that makes the people's daily average who take the bus, multiple buses in fact, very long actually, from making the traffic worse. And so I just want to throw that out and see if you could respond, please. Thanks.
So,
What was the question?
So the
The question is looking at transportation equity. And so a lot of the emphasis is actually improving urban space, the quality of life, but for people who are the beneficiaries of this, who are an elite class. And so that brings up the issue of how do we
about
have alternative forms of
affordability.
cheaper forms of transportation to, like Enrique Peñalosa advocates, prioritizing funds actually that doesn't make this problem worse, I guess, for often an ignored class of people that are increasingly invisible as people are increasingly displaced from the urban core. Workers are.
So, this is a very important issue. One of the things that we've seen in the GTA is that as we do invest in transit infrastructure, whereas 15 years ago, you actually took a little bit of a hit if you were too close to the subway line. Today, any units that are built near a subway line or near light rail transit sell first, and they sell for a premium. So what's happening is that as the middle class makes a big shift to using public transit, is that we're actually seeing poorer communities bumped farther out and having to take those long bus rides that you indicate. One of the challenges at a very basic level is this is actually a housing problem. It's in part about people being able to live close to where they work.
Right.
And unless we solve that problem, why are people traveling for very long distances? It has to do with where their jobs are, but it also has to do with segments and areas where people can't afford to live. And unless we start to begin to address, and it sounds like you have some inclusionary zoning here in New York, and you're beginning to address it, and we need to figure out how to address it in Toronto as well. But unless we really begin to address how we can create really complete communities where you have a whole variety of different housing types, this problem isn't going to go away, because the poorer you are, the farther you're going to get bumped out, because the more desirable a place is, the more expensive it becomes, and it just kind of creates this cascading ring around the great places or the complete communities that we do have. So I think this is really what you're talking about, is actually a housing problem and an affordable housing issue.
Other thoughts? Okay, let's go.
Okay, quick. I just saw the 5-minute warning sign come in.
You're
so-
fine.
Okay. Rick Antonson, I'm from Vancouver, and to segue into what I want to ask you, last week our mayor introduced, along with the board chair for Tourism Vancouver, a tourism master plan, talking much about when you're designing a city for the residents, you also have to be considerate of the visitors, and that happy is the day when what residents want, visitors also want, and it all comes together. But it gets back to the earlier comments you were making around livability, around the coming together of some of the intangible, hard to measure things that aren't just about economics. So the question is, and I'm sure many people in the room have had a chance to travel to the country of Bhutan, and those that haven't would maybe be aware that they measure, rather than gross national product, they measure gross national happiness. And it always gets a bit of a smirk until their lead elected official spoke at the United Nations and explained the measures that they use and how they evaluate things, like should they join the World Trade Organization. When they put it through their measures, they decided it would not increase the livability for the residents. It would not make things better for the people that call Bhutan home. So my question is there any thinking like that, or measures or writing that relate to cities and ways in which the non-traditional measures could be used? And it's about, why do you live here? Why would you live here? Because you don't live here just because you've got a box that's built higher up on the pile of boxes of the people who live below you.
Well, let me just talk about a couple of metrics we developed at Art Place America. One is a vibrancy index, which people laughed at us for. But in fact, it's turned out to be quite a sophisticated and wonderful tool that you can use at a very small geographic level to actually measure the traces. You can't measure vibrancy directly, but you can measure the traces of vibrancy. And I think that's pretty exciting. It's not happiness, but it's a very interesting metric. It's all open source, and you can use it to apply to any place. The other couple of metrics we've developed that I think are really exciting, one is we're looking at a diversity index, which measures not only racial and ethnic diversity, but looks at economic integration, which is almost never measured. And we spend... It's a good one. It's a really good one. And I won't tell you about it now, but if you're going to drinks, I'll tell you about it, if you could stand it. We actually looked at 40 years of so-called gentrification in America, in major cities, and found almost no evidence of it. In fact, what we found was very disturbing, in that if you were a census tract that was poor in 1970, almost none have flipped. And we could talk about that because it's actually runs very contrary to what most people believe is happening in America. And I think it's important to know. But I think those are a couple of metrics that are quite interesting and promising to get at a different way of thinking about what's happening.
Well, and also, just to add to that, if you're talking about unconventional means of financing, then you're looking at other kinds of metrics, like you're looking at health metrics, you're looking at environmental quality. So that naturally presses you to look at other things. And I know in our work, New York Restoration Project works in low-income communities, and we manage open spaces, some of which we own. And we're very sensitive to that question of gentrification, because we do see kind of a tipping that happens in neighborhoods. We renovate a garden that was filled with trash, then another one down the block renovates, and our goal isn't gentrification. So we are actually right now exploring other ways of evaluating, besides, let's say, increased tax revenue, what the benefit of what we do is. And I think some interesting work is coming out of work in low-income communities because of that sensitivity to gentrification.
Great. All right, we are... One more. Okay. I'm going to let you make the call. Can we have another question? One more question? Okay, go, quick, and we'll be quick.
Hi, Calvin Gladney from Mosaic Urban Partners. Question going back to density again. A lot of the neighborhoods that are densifying in the country have a rich history and culture and kind of way of life to them. And a lot of the densification that we're talking about seems to mostly remove that history, take away that culture, and even take away some of those people. So how can we densify our neighborhoods without losing the art, the history, the culture that were in those neighborhoods before they densified?
I think that echoes, Amanda Burden's comment earlier today, where she talked about how do you recognize and maintain the city's DNA? And at a neighborhood level, I think you're talking about the same thing. Ideas, quickly?
Well, if you do lose those things, you've done a bad job of densifying. I mean, I don't think that
So how would you do it? How would you densify? How would you grow and preserve what he's talking about?
I think you have to start with, I don't know the answer to that. I would, the one answer, and there isn't one answer, I'm sure you have an answer, but you have to start with, and you're going to give it in a minute. But I think you have to start with, you have to really understand what's there, because different people in the neighborhood have different ideas about what makes it a particular place.
I think the first order of business is to understand what makes it special, what makes it different than all the other places. What is the DNA versus, other places? And first, table that so that the advisory committee, the design folks, the professionals, everybody as a general baseline, that's where you start. And the character of the place is to remain, whatever that is. Whatever new densification or new development comes in has to be built upon what you identified as assets.
Jennifer, last word?
Well, I think it's very difficult to do that. I think it's very difficult to redevelop a place and to keep the essence of its character. It typically fundamentally changes for a whole variety of reasons, including people moving in and out. But we have one example in Toronto, Regent Park, large-scale social housing project from the 60s. It's been an absolute disaster, crime, drugs. And we are completely redeveloping it, and we're turning it into a mixed-use community that has market housing as well as social housing. And the objective has been to ensure that we replace the social housing units. But in fact, that project, I guess, is not what we're talking about, because we were trying to fundamentally change the DNA of the place because it wasn't very good, while at the same time retaining a substantive amount of affordable housing right in the core of the city. But I think that's a very difficult thing to do, because places also aren't static. They're always changing and they're always evolving.
Yeah, that's right.
So if you say, well, we want to protect the DNA of a place, but that DNA is constantly evolving, and you can't freeze frame it. So as you go and redevelop, it starts to become something new, and that's just the evolution of places. And the risk is that you lose communities and cultures that you value. And I think it's something for us to be very sober about.
But I do think it's interesting if you think about what Bruce said today, and talking about understanding your difference, and we've always talked about it in terms of distinctiveness. I think that's at a city or economic or regional economy level. I think it's also very relevant in terms of neighborhoods, right? So back to Joni's point, and we probably don't know enough about how to do that, and so it's a very good point, and something we'll talk about it over drinks. Thanks.
Thank you.